Just because the water is cold doesn't necessarily mean you can't go out there and have some really good days out on the water. As a matter of fact, I think in cold water, you have one of the best chances to catch the biggest bass that live in your body of water. And in today's video, I wanna talk about 5 lures that I bring with me every time I go cold water fishing. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by my apparel company, Finesse Fishing. If you guys didn't hear the big announcement that I had, my sun shirts are now made in the US. It's a really, really big deal for me, and I'm really hoping to transition all of my products to being USA made. And right now the sun shirts are specifically 25% off. My hats are on sale, my gloves are on sale. Everything is discounted for the holidays. So one of the best ways to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel is by shopping at Finesse Fishing. And I'm gonna leave a link down below in the description. Now, real quick, I kind of want to define what cold water is. This may be different depending on where you live in the country. For me, it's typically kind of below that 55-degree mark. I fish a lot when the water is in between the 40 and 55-degree mark, and the lures that I talk about today all work well in kind of that water degree temperature. Now, something that I love about fishing in cold water is it actually kind of narrows down the selection of lures and baits that I typically use. And so to me, I'm a guy who really likes to have a lot of rods on the front deck of the boat when I go fishing. So I actually kind of like the fact that it kind of narrows down the selection. And when it comes to fishing in cold water, kind of the characteristics that I look for in a lure include something that is subtle, something that you fish slower, and something that is typically a little bit smaller in size. And all the lures that I'm about to talk about kind of reflect that. So let's go ahead and jump into the lures. Now, the first one that I always have tied up with me is some sort of finesse swim bait. A finesse swim bait is actually a pretty good lure to use no matter the water temperature, but in cold water, I really like a finesse swim bait. And one of the biggest things that I like about it is its versatility. You can fish this a number of different ways, and you can also fish this in a number of different water columns. Sometimes you find that the fish are relating to the bottom. And so I'm gonna cast this thing out and I'm gonna slowly reel it across the bottom. Sometimes also when they're fishing it on the bottom, you can kind of just raise your rod and let that bait pendulum back down. That's kind of a sneaky way of catching fish that will react when they won't react to it just kind of hitting the bottom. Now, another thing that you can do if you happen to have forward-facing sonar like a Mega Live unit is you can target suspended fish with a finesse swim bait. Now, the particular swim bait that I have grown fond of is probably the same one that you like, and that is a Keitech Fat Impact. Now, I really like a 3.3 inch or even a 2.8 inch. I like something that's fairly small. And one of the biggest things that you want to make sure you're doing when you're fishing this bait in colder water is use the lightest head that you can get away with. And the reason that you want to use a light head in this situation is because if you use too big of a head, like in the summer, sometimes I'll use kind of an oversized jig head because it allows me to have really good feel of the bottom. I can reel that thing really, really fast. I want the exact opposite in the winter and in the cold water months. I want something that barely makes contact with the bottom from time to time and something that actually really forces me to slow down. I want something that forces me to slow down. So instead of using a 3/8 ounce jig head, I may use a 1/4 ounce. Instead of using a 1/4 ounce, I may use an 1/8 ounce. Now, if you're fishing this bait across the bottom in cold water, I also use a football jig head a lot. It just comes through that rock a little bit better. Now, lure number 2 is a finesse jig. To me, a finesse jig in colder water temperatures is probably the best chance that you have at catching a really, really big bass. You will at times get quite a few bites on a finesse jig in cold water, but the big thing about a finesse jig is it's typically gonna catch quality fish. The other thing that I love about a finesse jig is it's kind of like that Keitech. It's a very versatile bait. You can fish this in a number of different cover situations. For example, you can fish this around a dock. You can fish it in a wood laydown. You can fish it out on a rocky point. You can fish it down a creek channel swing bank. Those are all areas that I catch cold water bass in. Now, there are a lot of good finesse jigs out there on the market, but there are two specific ones that I've probably used the most over the years. One is kind of my inexpensive or cheap version, and that is a Strike King Bitsy Bug. I typically use the 1/4 ounce size when I'm fishing in the winter. Unless I'm fishing a little bit deeper, I really like that 1/4 ounce size. It has a really slow rate of fall, which again, I think is really important in the cold water months. Now, the other finesse jig that I really like, and the reason that I even started throwing this is because I got absolutely whooped by a guy in the back of my boat with this a number of years ago, and I picked this bait up, and that is a little Keitech tungsten finesse jig. I don't know what it is about this little Keitech finesse jig, but it is a straight up fish catching machine. I use the 3/8 ounce size a lot for this, and it should be said that with both of these jigs, I use the exact same chunk style trailer, and that is just a Zoom Super Chunk Junior. This is the type of chunk trailer that you want to use in cold water. You don't want a trailer that has a tremendous amount of action. You want something that is very subtle, and that chunk trailer, just a simple Zoom chunk trailer, will get the job done. Now, when it comes to rigging that chunk trailer, I typically just kind of let it hang off of my hook, just like this. There are times, especially if I'm going to be skipping a jig a lot, maybe I'm skipping it around docks in cold water, where I will thread that jig up there on the hook shank itself. Now, moving on to lure number 3, it's one of the best baits to cover a lot of water with in cold water, and that is a subtle crankbait. Now, the reason that I didn't just say crankbait is because it is extremely important in the cold water months to have a crankbait that is what I call subtle. Now, a subtle crankbait can be a flat-sided crankbait like this Berkley Fritz side that I'm holding right here. This has actually become one of my favorite cold water crankbaits. I fish it in a lot of different sizes and running depths. You kind of just have to use whatever caters the situation that you are fishing. To me, the Berkley Fritz side crankbait has basically replaced the Shad Rap style bait. I'm not saying that Rapala Shad Rap is not a good cold water crankbait at all, but to me, the Fritz side has kind of replaced it. And the biggest reason being is that these baits are designed to cast way easier than a Rapala Shad Rap. A Shad Rap can be a great bait, but typically I'm fishing it on a spinning rod. These baits I can throw on kind of my typical cranking setup, which is a 7-foot rod in either 10 or 12 pound test, and they are very easy to fish because of the way that they are weighted. Now, another really phenomenal cold water bait, this is one that's no secret at all, and that is a Rapala DT6 or a DT8. Again, the reason that this bait is good in colder water is because it is subtle. It's a balsa bait like most Rapala baits. It also doesn't have much of a rattle to it, so it's kind of silent coming through the water, which can be very good in those cold water situations. Now, the big thing that I will say when it comes to fishing a crankbait this time of the year is I'm not going to burn this bait. A lot of times I'm more or less going to creep the bait. So especially when you get into really cold water, like water temperatures anywhere in the 40s, I'm going to cast this bait out. I'm going to let it get to the bottom, and then I'm just kind of creep it along the bottom. I always want bottom contact, but I don't want to just get in a habit of just really cranking this thing a lot. Another thing that I do a lot with this bait is sweep the rod. So I'm going to cast the bait out, let it hit the bottom. I'm going to sweep the rod and then let it kind of float back a little bit and then sweep the rod again. That's a really, really good action to that bait. And some days you'll find that the bass will only hit that bait actually as it's rising back into their face. Now, lure number 4 is a very old school lure, and I highly suggest that you try it if you are a new school angler and just haven't tried it, and that is a simple blade bait. Now, there's a ton of different blade baits out there on the market. You have kind of your like original silver buddy, and these baits are all very similar. The biggest differences in these baits is the way that they quiver. When you actually, if you tie up a bunch of these blade baits side by side, you cast them out and you actually start working them on the bottom, you will feel that some have a really aggressive vibration and some have a little bit more subtle of a vibration. Now, one that has a little bit more subtle vibration, one that I use a lot in the winter, especially recently, is one of the Mega Bass blade baits. These blade baits are one of the only, if not the only, that have this small little feather on the back. And I think that that feather actually makes this bait a little bit more subtle in the water. I think because of the drag of that little feather, it doesn't have quite the vibration that you will get with some other blade baits. And I think that that's actually a good thing, especially if you're fishing in really, really cold water. I actually just fished this bait out on Lake Erie like last week and caught a lot of smallmouth on this exact bait right here. Now, to me, when it comes to blade bait fishing, I, for whatever reason, have always done extremely well with the color gold. I don't know what it is. It's one of the only lures that I will fish that is gold, but I have done really well with a gold colored blade bait. Now, the biggest key when it comes to fishing a blade bait is you do not want to rip this thing up in cold water. You are fishing this bait a lot like you do that jig, except for I'm gonna fish this on a spinning rod. I'm gonna cast this bait out, I'm gonna let it hit the bottom, I'm gonna pull it up only about 6 inches to a foot, and then let it drop and hit the bottom. Sometimes I'm actually gonna let it sit on the bottom for a minute. And I know it sounds weird because you got treble hooks on this bait and you don't usually fish a treble hook bait like that, but I'm fishing this bait a lot like a jig in cold water. And this bait, I'm telling you what, in the coldest water that you will fish, a blade bait will dominate, and especially if you're fishing it around smallmouth. Smallmouth absolutely love this thing. Now, lure number 5 is one that everybody knows is a good cold water bait, but every single year it continues to produce in really, really cold water, and that is a jerkbait. Now, in particularly, I really like in cold water a Berkley Stunna jerkbait. And I actually did kind of a full video about this bait and why I like it so much in cold water, and I'm gonna leave a link for that right here. So if you wanna know why this is the best cold water jerkbait, you can click on this link right here. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.